Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us.
On the phone, I have Jeffrey Neto. He's a Canadian-Brazilian author who lives in Ottawa. Today, we're going to talk about his debut novel, A Century of Promises. Hey, welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, you've written a book which is focusing on 100 years in El Salvador, but you've written it as a fictional novel based on true events. What was your decision in the making of this book and not simply writing a nonfiction book?
It first started off as a nonfiction adventure. So, about a family in El Salvador and the ups and downs. And I wanted to mimic the very famous 100 Years of Solitude. But
okay.
as the more I started to do my research, the more I started to learn about the country, through people such as my wife and her family. The more I started to realize that there's a broader story here that should be told and that hasn't been told to a wider audience. And so I decided to, combine, the true stories of people that have grown up in El Salvador and then have made their way to Canada and elsewhere, but also staying true to the facts of the country and also telling it in a way that's amusing, entertaining, and that allows people to really gain a better insight of the countries and the changes that were taking place during these times.
For sure. I always enjoy learning about something in a more accessible way than just looking at statistics, because what you're doing is you're humanizing the struggle. You're humanizing the people when you tell it in stories. Now, let's get into the novel. One of your main characters, lawyer Juan Alonso Hernandez, he comes to El Salvador in 1917. He comes into conflict as a lawyer defending plantation workers. And I was in El Salvador in 2014, and my first impression was, wow, this country is very different. It's very agriculturally based. And you see people walking around with machetes, and there's a lot of agriculture going on all over. I remember seeing people riding on the back of sugarcane trucks and the coffee plantations. Can you talk a little bit about how the geography of El Salvador has shaped the people and the economy of that place?
Absolutely. It was really interesting because, it's a country that's surrounded and that's made up of volcanoes. So wherever you go, there's a different type of volcano. And so the geography has had a huge impact on the economy. So during that time, the early 1900s, that was the beginning of the transformation from agricultural land to mass coffee production. You started to see landowners acquire a large percentage of the country's land. You started to see a concentration of wealth and power and influence, all starting to happen around one commodity. And the reason why this is so important from a geography perspective is because the best coffee plantations are those at a higher altitude, and the soil from volcanoes help produce higher quality coffee. Mm-hmm. And so when that was met with global demand, you just saw a huge amount of export happening, and because of that, you started to get the have-nots and the haves, and that concentration of power also led to control of the institutions, of the public institutions. It started to give those in power more political wealth and authority. And, that was the beginning of decades and decades of a political struggle between those with nothing and those who were trying to keep and maintain their power. And so that was the one of the reasons why I focused and wanted to start the story at that particular moment, because it was the perfect overlap between geography and political advancement.
Listening to the stories, there was a seething resentment about foreign ownership and about the giant wealth inequality. Many Salvadorian peasants working on the plantations, of course, couldn't afford to even have coffee. So maybe touch a little bit about how as time went on, the people started to organize around more rights and more equity within this agricultural economy.
Like in every social movement, the organization always started off with a sense and an experience of social injustice. And so because everyone, regardless of where they live, regardless of the type of work that they were doing, they identified with a certain class and they started to come together. And then you had individuals that were questioning the social status, were asking for more food, better wages. They were asking for more opportunities, not for themselves, but also for their families and for the future generation. And they could continuously see that, with all this money, with all this work and production that was happening, there was very little that was falling literally onto their plates. And so you started to have different types of movements shaping up in different parts of rural El Salvador. And this was the beginning of the lefties movement. It was very socialist in nature. And then over time, it started to get different shades of it. But at the onset, it was really about how could we guarantee a better future, have a better quality of life for us and for our families. And it was a very on the ground guerrilla type of movement and challenging the current authorities. So that's really what I try to capture in the book.
Okay.
And highlight how it was taking place on farms. It was taking place at bars, when families would go to masses, when they would gather in the square. All of these things culminated into an uprising that took place in the early 30s. That really until this day, it still leaves a very, very ugly stain on the country, and it's something that they still talk about and they're still healing from.
Many of the countries of Latin America, as you know, and also Brazil, where you're from, were victims of dictatorship and dirty wars of the 80s, where resources were coveted and mass repression visited the people there. I think in the West, we kind of live in a bubble. And speak about the family, the Castaneda family that you write about, as a typical Salvadorian family, how they experienced these periods in the generations and how this impacted and how they responded.
Yeah, so I try to have a balance there. I didn't want the book to be one-sided where, it's just one family, suffering for over 100 years. I wanted to show the rise of this family and also keep truth to the actual stories of the actual personal stories that I was hearing from individuals and what I was finding when I was reading about during my research. And so you have that point of view from the Castaneda family of someone that arrives in San Salvador because they were studying abroad. They see this social injustice happening. They see landowners taking over patches of land and forcing peasants and farmers out of their land and giving them nothing in exchange for all that. And so on the other side of that, you also had a very organized state with not only political authority and capitalists, but you also had the military might, the police that were organized and that would enforce the rule of law. And the rule of law was something that benefited only one class. It wasn't something that was equal. And so I also put that perspective into the story by dividing the family up and introducing those conflicts of, of brothers being on opposite side of the laws, of mothers, trying to have a relationship with their daughters and their sons, but their view of the world is something in complete contrast to what they believe in. In doing that, you get to see both sides of the story. And it's not so much that I'm trying to, get the reader to sympathize with, those that were, punishing the vast majority of the people. But I think that if you want to understand and get a comprehensive understanding of the story of El Salvador, you have to look at it from multiple perspectives. And that's what I tried to do in this book through the eyes of the Castaneda family.
In the 80s, as you know, there was many massacres, there was many repression and disappearance of union leaders. So how do you square this idea that I guess the government or the dictatorship had a kind of a point of view on that side? Like I'm having trouble kind of dotting that out.
Yeah. Well, it's to show how pervasive the messaging and of the state was, of the military was. Mm-hmm. How you could take someone that really had a strong idea of social justice, and you put them in an environment filled with propaganda, and you tell them that this is how the world is structured. This is what these other rebels are trying to do. They're trying to destroy the social order, the status quo.
Right.
And you really get this, a massive brainwashing across the population, and you see that in any totalitarian dictator regimes, and that was really taking place here in the 80s in El Salvador, and what the state was trying to do to the people. And so that's why the resistance started to increase more and more. That's why you started to get better organizations of those on the left, the guerrilla groups really, taking the fight to, the mountains and organizing themselves and just getting better organized. And so the story really shows how someone who wasn't originally like that, they come from humble beginnings, but how different choices in their life had led them to this particular position. Right. And eventually, they learned their lesson, and you get to see that transformation of the character. You get to see that transformation of the family, and it's I found it, and what people have told me, it has been a very eye-opening experience, because at the end of the day, we're all born good, but it's our environment that makes us behave and act in a way that many would see as morally unjust, and in a way that also causes physical damage and physical pain to others. And I think the story that tells that story of how someone that has a lot of good intention could be coerced and brainwashed by the state, by political authorities, by ideas, and end up causing more harm than good. And so I think there's a lot of stories about that in the book, and facts as well that capture that.
For sure. I guess we underestimate the absolute power of the state, and we like to think that the people in charge are good people. I mean, I would imagine to this day in the United States, there's people who still believe that we were just caring about democracy in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and we want to spread. And exactly. I remember the time in the 80s where you would, before the internet, you talk to people and say, "Oh, they're fighting off the communists. They're just taking care of these evil communists," and people would really go for that. I think what opened a lot of eyes was the movie Romero, where based on the story of the Bishop Romero for the Catholic Church, he was speaking about injustice and was actually murdered by death squads and some U.S. nuns, which started waking people up. So I guess we don't want to underestimate the power of the state and the power to manipulate the narrative in conflict is what we're seeing every day when we turn on the news. Talk about the diaspora, because El Salvador is one of the countries that has one of the largest diaspora. Many people. I think there's more people living outside El Salvador than actually stayed. So, do you want to touch on that and how that affects the culture?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Right. There's more people living abroad than in El Salvador. Something along the lines of 30% of El Salvador's GDP is based on remittances, so money from Salvadorans living abroad, sending it back to the country. So a big chunk of El Salvador's identity, both at the individual level, but also at the national level as well, is on this idea that we need to create a life outside of our country, and then give money, give knowledge, give expertise back at some capacity. Mm-hmm. And so it robs the human capital of the country when you have decades and decades of people fleeing the country. And I think every Salvadorian that you meet, they all have a story of, either it's them or it's their relative or it's a friend of moving abroad, going through that struggle of being an immigrant. And that's something that the book captures as well. Near the end of the book, Canada played an important role during the El Salvador Civil War in accepting refugees from El Salvador, and so that story and history is captured in the book as well. And we still see that today in Canada when you speak to someone that is Salvadoran, and they talk about how they had to flee the country and how they came to Canada and Canada welcomed them. But then there was a lot of challenges once you arrive here, and you're trying to raise a family, you're trying to work. You don't speak the language. The weather is very different. Mm-hmm. People are different, and that's a challenge not only particular to Salvadorans but to any immigrant and any newcomer in Canada. And so I think that's why the book is not just about El Salvador, but it's about anyone who needs to leave their country. To come to a different country to experience a better life.
For sure, nobody wants to come and live in Winnipeg when they're in El Salvador, unless there's a big problem. I'm telling you. Also, there's a place in Vancouver here that a lot of Chilean refugees came to. Can you speak to the resilience? Like when I was in El Salvador, the people were so friendly and nice, but they were tough and resilient and wonderful. So can you speak a little bit about kind of the resilience to having experienced this kind of multi-generational trauma, and then to just still be doing it, to still be there and still be building a better life?
I think that it just speaks to the Salvadoran people when decades after decades of oppression, of little hope, the title of the book is called A Century of Promises, because over a century it's been one promise after another that the country will get better, and that in large part hasn't really happened until you could argue until recently. But the resilience of the Salvadoran people, it's the same type of resilience that you see with Chileans, Argentinians, Venezuelans, Brazilians, and it's that ability that I need to provide for my family. I need to have a better quality of life for myself, for my kids. I have to give them more opportunities, and regardless of the obstacle, regardless of the setback, it's this ability to persevere, it's this ability to hope and to continue fighting for something that you believe in. And you see the manifestation of that, and young people taking up arms to fight against the government. You see the manifestation of that in something as simple as starting a business, right? But also the difficulties that comes with that, of having to provide, and also just waking up in the morning and going to work, and doing the grunt work that no one wants to do. And I think you see that on a day-to-day basis. It's not something that just happens and disappears, but it's something that's ingrained in you. And I see that every time I talk to Salvadoran people, and they share their personal stories with me.
Yeah, for sure. When I was there in 2014, there was a couple of American citizens who were also born in El Salvador who returned to open a hotel, open some businesses. So things are looking up a little bit. My mother-in-law is always visiting there, and she loves it there. So she says everybody's happy now. I'm a little skeptical about everybody's happy now, but talk a little bit about. There's a new government there. I think there's a little bit of repression, but some people I talk to are happy that they're cracking down on gangs and such, but I'm a little skeptical about that.
Yeah, I could speak to my own experience. I've been to El Salvador several times in the past 5-6 years, and I still remember the first time I went there. There was this sense of unease wherever I went. Also, whenever I decided to take the bus, whenever I decided to go to a restaurant, go to the beach, it was always met with, be careful, don't go in that direction. Make sure, you're home by this time. Don't venture off to that neighborhood. And there was a lot of closed shops as well, right? People just seemed very hopeless. The conversations around the table was always centered around, where can I go? Should I go to the U.S.? Should I go to Canada? Should I go to Europe? You still had this sense that I have to leave this country if I want to have an opportunity. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, regardless of, the criticism that the current government is getting and the politics, but just on the ground, when I go back there, it's a different environment. The conversation now is, how do I build something for me and my family here in El Salvador? How do I open up a business? There's a new hotel. You should go check it out. So there is a little bit more confidence. The security is definitely back. The sense of tranquility, of hope, it's definitely back in the country. The question is, is the current approach sustainable, and will it last? I think only time will tell. But you could really see a big transformation in the country from 6-7 years to now.
When you speak to people, not many people who don't have a direct contact, they really think about El Salvador. It doesn't cross the radar. It doesn't hit the news very often. From your research, from writing this book, what do you think is the largest or the biggest misconception people might have about El Salvador?
I think the biggest misconception is really that it's there's nothing there but volcanoes and gangs, and honestly, like, up to a certain point that was true, but there's just so much more there. There's all sorts of things happening in terms of tourism. More people are going to the country. Their investments is flowing into the country as well, and it's starting to change. I also think that El Salvador is a bit overshadowed by Mexico, Guatemala, the bigger Central American countries, and so it has had a hard time to find its own identity and personality, and so that's something that it has struggled with in the past. And right now, you're starting to see a different El Salvador. It's still a very young country, and the more it starts to, find itself, the more it starts to promote, all the good that it has. The more we could see a El Salvador that has more personality and has more to offer.
For sure. I was really nervous to go down myself, and when I got there, the people were wonderful and accommodating, and I never felt out of place. I felt really good there. How can people access your book or review your book?
Great question. So my book could be easily found on Amazon, across all Amazon website, U.S. and Canada. It's also available if you're in the U.S. in Barnes & Noble, and if you're in Canada, in Chapters. And my email is acenturyofpromisesnovel@gmail.com. So if there's any question, if you want to learn more about the book or just get in touch with me, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, fabulous. Well, thanks for taking a few minutes this afternoon. I'm really happy you're taking time to examine and do your research, because I think it gives other people an opportunity to actually dig in there and find out for themselves. So thanks again for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.